Hey, my name is Aishwarya, and welcome back to Assistive Insight, where we have another interview today with Kevin Alexander. How are you doing today, Kevin?
Doing well.
Oh, that's great. Kevin has, and forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, phenylketonuria.
Yeah, that's good. I pronounce it phenylketonuria. I think
Okay,
people who have it pronounce it different ways, but that's pretty close. Yeah,
okay. So I'm just going to be referring to it as PKU because,
that's how I refer to it too.
yeah. So PKU is a rare disease, and is an inherited disorder. So in our typical bodies, people who don't have PKU, our bodies break down the proteins in foods such as meat or fish and turn them into amino acids. And these amino acids are then used to make our own proteins. And any amino acids that are needed to be broken down further are then removed from the body. But people with PKU are unfortunately unable to break down those amino acids, a certain amino acid called phenylalanine, which then builds up in their
Phenylalanine.
blood.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to
Don't
pronounce it.
worry. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. You were in the middle of pitching that, so I'm sorry for
it's
interrupting.
okay. Yeah, no, just correct me if I'm wrong. But
No worries.
then that protein, which is not able to be broken down, builds up in their blood and brain, and this can lead to brain damage. So at around 5 days old after birth, babies are offered, blood spot screening to test for PKU and many other conditions. And if PKU is confirmed, treatment will be given straight away to reduce the risk of serious complications. And treatment, I'm not sure if it changes as you grow older, but initially includes, a special diet and regular blood tests. And with an early diagnosis and the correct treatment, most children with PKU are able to live healthy lives. But it is a very rare disease. Like there's fewer than 20,000 cases a year. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right. I think the different estimates I've seen that at least in the United States there may be about 20,000 or less total in the United States. I think
Okay.
10 years ago the figure I saw was 50,000 in the world.
Wow. Okay.
I was actually, let's see, I think I was 9 days old.
Okay.
My grandmother was actually taking care of me. She was the one that received the call from the doctor. And fortunately, that doctor had looked up, he had to look up PKU because he'd never really dealt with it before. But the
Hmm.
information that he received gave him some of the good information about it that, with treatment, it can develop, lead to healthy outcomes. Unfortunately, a lot of people, especially these days, if they go on Google, sometimes the information they get at the very, very beginning isn't quite as encouraging, and they kind of only see the negative side of things. And I
Right.
mean, both are true, but one involves no treatment or poor treatment versus healthy treatment. Yeah.
Right. So is it possible that there are a lot of, when people are diagnosing PKU, or maybe just looking at it symptom based? I know some symptoms include seizures, like, behavioral disorders. Is it possible to, misdiagnose that?
I don't hear many cases of misdiagnosis of PKU anymore, and part of that's just because PKU, we have this newborn screening system that
Right.
detects a variety of conditions, right? Well, PKU is actually the very first condition that was screened for. Screening for PKU and other conditions began in like 1963 for the first time in Massachusetts,
Okay.
and then it expanded to all the other states after that. And so in the United States now, it's very, very rare that PKU is either misdiagnosed or completely not diagnosed because of the newborn screening system we have in the U.S.
Okay.
But the problem is it's really kind of for us comes down to access for treatment.
Yeah.
It's you talked about how does treatment evolve or change over time? Well, like in our case, their understanding of treatment back in the 60s and 70s is different than the way they understood it when I was born, and even different the way we understand it today. And so
Right.
I have friends who were older than me that were taken off treatment at a very young age because doctors thought that the brain was fully developed at the time and it would be safe to take them off. And over time, they realized that's not the case. And so those individuals started developing some cognitive problems. And so eventually the decision was made to keep people with PKU on treatment for life. And that's kind of how the way they talk about it now.
Okay, that's good. So, based on what you said about access, then I assume that there are probably more cases of PKU outside of the US, or cases of untreated PKU, because
Correct.
US is so high socioeconomically, right?
Yeah, so a perfect example of that is, in my day job, I'm working broadcasting and these days commercial video production. I used
Hmm.
to be in television news, and
Okay.
so I do a lot of video projects for PKU and newborn screening. And 10 years ago this year, actually, I did a short documentary that's called For Katie, and it was telling the story of a girl who was born. Her parents were living in Mexico at the time, but she was born in Mexico. They eventually brought her back to the United States, and in the year or so after she was born, she was started experiencing some problems. They couldn't figure out what the reason was, and eventually at 13 months, she was diagnosed with PKU.
Okay.
Problem was she was born in Mexico at a time when newborn screening wasn't a requirement the way is here in the US. I'm not sure what their policy is now, but it wasn't required. And because of that, she was completely misdiagnosed. They didn't catch it. And so, I think she's 17 now, almost 18. And her life with PKU is very, very different than my life with PKU and others with PKU, because she was not diagnosed until 13 months. And at that point, she had suffered some significant brain damage.
Right. Okay. So in terms of, the symptoms like brain damage and seizures, have you experienced any of those?
I haven't, thankfully.
Okay.
I have been mostly on treatment my entire life. I use that word mostly because my age, I was born in the 80s. And at that time, my doctors told me that maybe one day when I was older, when I was an adult, I might be able to go off diet and kind of eat a more normal protein, higher protein diet. And so as I got older and became a teenager, I started experimenting with newer foods for me. I never really ate like meat or steak, but I tried some other foods like bacon and chicken in small amounts to see what I liked. And the problem was, when you don't know that you like something, then it's easy to not eat it. But once you know that you like something, it becomes hard.
You're right. Yeah.
So as a teenager, late teenager, early college years, I was having some difficulty in school because just mood and attention focus and all of that. And so I didn't have the more extreme, symptoms like seizures and things like that, but I was having some of the more, cognitive and mood aspects of things and motivation issues. And so my early college years were kind of difficult, but eventually in my 20s, that's when I wasn't feeling well. When I was at work and I was working very, very long hours, I was tired and extremely lethargic. And
Hmm.
my wife suggested I get back in touch with the clinic again. And that's the time they told me about treatment for life. And so once I kind of got back on treatment, it felt like a night and day difference. And I felt so much better.
Okay.
Uh,
That's good. Yeah.
but I haven't experienced the more difficult symptoms that others might have.
Okay. That's really good to hear. So because you haven't experienced such severe symptoms, do you think that, PKU has, other than like attention span or those types of symptoms, has PKU really hindered your efforts at doing anything or?
You know, I I always encourage other people with PKU to not let anything hold them back.
Right.
I mean, I understand that for those who are older than me, or maybe even my age, who had different experiences than me, I mean, being realistic, I understand that PKU may have prevented them from doing certain things because of the symptoms they experienced. But for those who are younger, growing up today, I always encourage them. We live in a different time now where treatment for PKU has evolved so much. I mean,
Hmm.
they talk about for rare diseases, there's 10,000 different rare diseases.
Yeah.
And of those 10,000 rare diseases, 95% of them don't have any treatment whatsoever, where PKU does. But it
Hmm.
not only has the basic treatment of low protein diet, and we also have this medical drink that we have to drink that has protein that we can consume. And it's the thing that's, I think, difficult for us in the PK community when we communicate about this is, we use terms like diet. And you may have heard me throughout this interview talk about the word treatment instead. And I prefer to call it a treatment because that's what it is. It's a medical treatment. If you use the word diet, people think that that's a choice, or
Right.
people think fad diets or whatever. But for us, eating a bag of pretzels is a medical decision.
Okay.
There's some kids who just to give you a point of reference, for most people with PKU, the amount of protein they can eat in a day is around 4 to 8 grams of protein in a day. The
Okay.
average adult eats around 50 to 60 grams in a day. So, people on that very, very low end of the spectrum have to be very diligent about what they eat, and they have to eat these specially created low protein foods, like foods that that are designed to be low in protein. So it might be low protein bread or low protein pasta.
Okay.
And when I talk about access being a challenge, part of that challenge is that food is extremely expensive because it's medical food. And
Right.
it's not affordable and accessible to most people. And with insurance the way it is in the US, sometimes when somebody lives in one state, there's no insurance mandate. So, somebody who has diabetes, everybody understands they need their insulin, it's covered by insurance, but people don't really understand PKU. So the low protein foods and the formulas aren't always covered by insurance. It really just depends on what state you live in.
Right. So have you also had to, part of the treatment, have you had to eat less protein rich foods like that?
So growing up, I grew up at a time where there wasn't as much access to some of the specially created low protein food, and my tolerance was also a little bit higher. So as a kid, other people were eating about 4 to 8 grams. As a child, for me, it was probably the range of more like 10 to 15. When I was an adult, it was around 20 grams.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to eat kind of more natural foods like, fruits and vegetables and things like that, and figure out what I could eat that was naturally low in protein that I could tolerate because I could eat some of those other things in moderation. I am personally now on one of those newer treatments that's available
Okay.
that for me has been kind of like a miracle drug. I mean, it's something I take every single day. It allows me to eat more natural protein, and not everybody who's on it has the same level of response that I did, but in my case I can eat around 50 grams of natural protein now, so I can eat almost a normal, quote, normal diet.
Right. Yeah.
I still can't eat meat and other animal products like that, but I can
Mhm.
eat some things like real bread and pasta and even some dairy.
That's good. So growing up when you were younger, since you weren't able to get that protein quota in, did that affect your growth and development in any way?
When I was younger, I don't think so because I was drinking that low protein or that medical drink that's higher in protein for me, and that was like my source of protein when I couldn't eat some of these other foods. I would say probably so though as I got older, because again, understanding of PKU has changed. At the same time I was experimenting with new foods, I wasn't drinking as much of that medical drink, and so I wasn't getting the protein that I needed. So, whether it's related to PKU or whether it's just family genetics, for a very, very long time I was severely underweight. And it
Yeah.
wasn't until I got on this newer medication that I was actually able to build kind of some healthy weight.
Okay, that's good. You mentioned that when you were growing up, you were, underweight. It changed when you grew older. So,
Mhm.
is there any point of time where you kind of, faced mistreatment because of PKU, or was it just kind of non-visible? No one really knew about it.
When you say mistreatment, how do you mean specifically?
I mean, like, when some people have chronic illnesses, people don't really treat them well. They treat them differently, like
Yeah.
they're, you know what I mean?
Yeah. If you're like, you mean like in the sense of bullying, maybe?
Bullying and also
Yeah.
maybe just like,
Yeah, definitely. I
yeah.
mean, I would say that I don't think I ever, I mean, I only had one case when I was in middle school that somebody actually said to me that I made it up. And I thought, you think that I can make up a word like phenylketonuria?
Yeah.
Well, thank you, because you think I'm imaginative.
Yeah.
But and I so I'm hosting started hosting a podcast in the last few months, and
Mhm.
it's kind of exploring. It's called Never Give Up, a rare disease podcast, and it's
Okay.
kind of exploring the relationship between rare disease life and mental health issues and things like that. And I'm kind of weaving in stories from my personal life with also kind of this rare disease life and kind of mashing it all together. And one of those stories I talk about was actually the very, very first speech I ever gave about PKU. I've, in the last decade or so, I've done a lot of traveling, a lot of speaking about PKU. But that very, very first one was when I was in middle school. And I vividly remember at the end of the speech, somebody asked me what would have happened if I had not been diagnosed with PKU. And I told them the truth. The truth was that I'd be institutionalized for life. And, the classroom just erupted into laughter.
Mm.
And, for those kids, that was just another moment in life that they would never, ever remember. For me, it was a moment I'll never forget.
Yeah.
And experiences like that were kind of common where, because you're different, then you're treated as different, even if it's not somebody overtly saying, hey, you have this rare disease and therefore, I don't want to be friends with you or whatever.
Right.
When you're constantly, the outcast, different, people definitely treat you that way sometimes. And
Yeah.
for me, it was pretty bad in middle school. It was, not the first couple of years of high school weren't that great, but I started kind of meeting other people later in high school who didn't care, thankfully. And by the time I got into college, it really wasn't an issue. I mean, still to this day, food is like one of the most social experiences we have. Think about
Yeah.
all the different celebrations in life that are just centered around food. How many of our holidays are centered around food? But when what you can and can't eat is the subject of conversation,
Yeah.
then you kind of stand out. And sometimes you don't want to stand out. You just want to blend in. And so you try to
Yeah.
figure out ways to blend in. But when people constantly bring it up and you say things like, well, I can't eat meat. And they're like, well, that's the saddest thing I've ever heard. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, not really. It just
Right.
means I don't eat like you.
Yeah.
So you just kind of, have to learn how to be comfortable with yourself and not care about what other people think. That's really, really hard when you're young. But as you get older, it gets a little bit easier because you start realizing what really is important and what's not important. And the biggest change that I think I've seen in my life that's really helped me with my rare disease experience, honestly, is social media. In the
Mhm.
last few years, social media has gotten a bad rap because of, some of the negative news out there, which is very, very true. But
Yeah.
the flip side of that, there's a second side to every story. And the second side of that story is that it's been amazing for the rare disease community.
Yeah.
Because when I first shared I produced, in 2011, I produced this short film about my life called My PKU Life.
Mhm.
And at the time, there wasn't really anything like it on YouTube, and there really wasn't, social media was really just kind of getting going. There wasn't, the community was just starting to build. And so suddenly you're starting to meet people online, and you're like, oh my God, how did I have life like this before? And
Yeah.
people growing up today, they don't necessarily remember a life before social media, but before social media, it was really, really isolating and lonely to have a rare disease because you just didn't, in many cases, you never met anybody with the same condition or any other condition for that matter.
Yeah. And there's
And
a lot
so
of people, yeah. There's a lot of people online, those similar diseases. They build, support groups. There are support groups everywhere that you can join. People
yeah,
like you, I started listening to your podcast a little, and I thought it was like I only listened to a little, but from what I heard so far, it was very, encouraging of your story, and it felt almost empowering. I don't have PKU, but if I did, I would definitely feel really good listening to that. So I will definitely link that in my
yeah,
description because I think it's a really good listen for anyone who needs to, hear
thank you.
empowering words. Yeah.
I talk about this in the show, but for the longest time, I've been very, very active in the PK community specifically since 2011, 2012. And same thing, I've done a lot of newborn screening advocacy, and I've done a little bit in the rare disease world, but not as much as in those two specific communities. And part of the reason why is because I thought, I'm one of those 5% that has a treatment, whereas the 95% don't. And I didn't feel like that my story, that people could necessarily relate to my story. But what I ultimately realized is that's as it relates to the specifics of our rare disease experience. My experience with rare disease with PKU is different than somebody else. It's very different than somebody else who doesn't even have like a metabolic disorder, which is what PKU is.
Right.
But even amongst the metabolic disorders, there's some similarities, but the experiences are still very different. But all of us, if you live with a rare disease, you deal with that loneliness, that isolation, that frustration that your body has limitations, that you may have some things you want to do in life that you just can't do that you would love to do. I talk
Yeah.
about this in the last episode of my podcast of season 1. But for me, I grew up in a family that had a strong tradition of military service, and that's something I wanted to do, but I couldn't do because of PKU.
Hmm.
But what I've realized is there was a principle behind that, which was I just wanted to serve my community. And there's a variety of ways that you can serve your community. So whatever your rare disease experience is, you may have a specific thing that you want to do that you maybe can't do. But if you look at that in just a little bit different way and figure out, okay, but what's the principle behind that thing? What else can I do with it?
Yeah.
People talk about all the time that, life doesn't come with a handbook and just says, here, do this. But when you have a rare disease, it feels like that even more so because everybody has this vision of what life is supposed to be. And you go to school, maybe you go to college, maybe you go immediately start working, then you have a family, you do this and that. But when you have a rare disease, somewhere along that way, that path can kind of diverge, and you're off over here, and you're like, well, everybody else talks about life over here and what you're supposed to do if this is your life, but nobody has told me what I'm supposed to do with my life if it's over here.
Yeah.
So you have to just kind of figure that out on your own.
Right.
And the beauty of the rare disease community online is that we're not alone. The more we're all kind of gathering over here in this world now, and instead of feeling like we're alone, we realize, hey, that person has a rare disease, and even though it's completely different than mine, and I don't understand some of their specific circumstances, they understand what it's like to be different. They understand
Yeah.
what it's like to have a life that's rare and uncommon. And, I say this at one point in my podcast that, we have a rare and uncommon life. And to me, that just means that we can either let that hold us back and sour our attitude. And I'm not trying to just be cliche here, but frankly, the flip side of that is we have the capability of being rare, uncommon people
Yeah.
because we see the world in a different way than other people do. And we can enact change in a way that other people can't because we don't have a choice but to speak up in many cases because we're speaking up for ourselves and we're speaking up for others.
Right. So just looking around those roadblocks, trying to find a way to do what you want to do, just seeing past your disease kind of, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's really amazing, and which is why it's another reason I think that it's really important to raise awareness for these types of things, because I wouldn't want anyone to go through, being so isolated or being treated differently just because someone doesn't know what they're going through, right?
Right. I mean, there's
Right.
people now that I've known for the last 10 years that really do. It's not a cliche. They really feel like family to me now because you develop this close connection because there's this like this unspoken language of, many of us who have, who are adults now who have PKU, we have these conferences every few years. And, there's typically you'll show up and there's a table and it's just full of adults with PKU. And all we want to do is just sit together and talk,
Yeah.
and it's because we all grew up, we all had that life. A lot of times we're not even specifically talking about PK. Sometimes we do, but sometimes we're just talking about life or whatever, because PK is the one thing we don't have to talk about because
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
immediately understand it. We
Yeah.
immediately understand each other because of PKU. And
Right.
so, I've made friendships in this space that to me are some of my deepest friendships now, and some of my, that mean the most to me because, we're all bonded by this rare disease experience, and for many of us we're very very involved in advocacy, and so it's just an experience that bonds you even if you don't know each other well outside of that space. You
Yeah.
don't know somebody's favorite color or whatever else. That doesn't matter. You're bonded by some of the deeper things in life that really matter the most.
Yeah. Just kind of taking advantage of any opportunities to form new relationships, form new connections, talk with different people is very important part of, having a rare disease and thriving with it, not letting
Right.
it, push you down, just kind of choosing to see the upside, choosing to see the positive. It's very important. Yeah.
And I know that's, and I don't want to make light of one thing. I know that for some people who have a rare disease, their experience is extremely difficult. And I'm not
Right.
denying that. I completely recognize that. I recognize that my experience in comparison to many others out there with a rare disease, I mean, it's totally different. And
Yeah.
I'm in a situation where, you know, my rare disease just influences what I can and can't eat. And because of the treatment that I've received, I'm doing okay. I realize that. Even
Yeah.
in the PK community, though, there's a variety of different people with different experiences. People who want to be on treatment, but frankly can't get access to it because of insurance issues,
Yeah.
or people who were taken off diet at a young age, not of their own choice, and were off diet for 20 something years and now have cognitive impairment because of it. And I understand that there's other people out there with different rare diseases. And I think the problem is when we start comparing our lives to somebody else's life and say that's the standard, and I can only be happy if I have their life. you
Yeah.
know I think that for other people whose experience with a rare disease that I can't understand, all I can say is, you know don't look at those other people as validation for what your experience is. And you may have an extremely difficult life, and maybe your goal of success is to have a good day,
Yeah.
and that's your goal. That's the thing. And it's a different burden, and I completely understand that, but it's all, to me, it's all about trying to find that, that different way of looking at life that helps you kind of get through and realize that because of your experiences, what, it's not saying that, well, it would be better if you didn't have that experience or whatever. You have that experience, and the best thing you can do is just accept it and move on,
Right. Yeah.
and then try to find the way that you can use that to make your own life better and maybe help other people as well.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely insightful approach. That's very helpful advice for anyone who might be, struggling similarly or struggling very differently than you in general. Yeah. So it was amazing to talk to you and get all this advice from you. Yeah.
Thank you very
And
much.
I
Thank you.
also learned a lot about the disease, so that's really great. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you as well.
Absolutely.
But it was nice to see you. Bye.
Thank you very much.